think there seems to be some issue with regard to Shilpa coming online. Let me just sorry, I'm pausing this for a bit. Let me try and reach out to her and figure out.
Hello.
Shilpa, you there?
Yes, sir. I'm sorry. I think there was some internet issues.
All right.
So,
Please.
as sir mentioned, the without any document that is headed without prejudice under the English common law has been accorded a privilege from being admissible in evidence. What basically the rule says is that any communication exchanged between parties while they are negotiating any dispute that has arisen between them will then not be admissible in evidence against the interest of a party that has made this communication. Before going more into the rule and how it works and what are the exceptions to it, I'll just briefly like to differentiate this privilege that is available to parties from the existing privileges under the Evidence Act, as we all already know. I'm not going to go into detail, but everybody would be aware that there is an attorney-client privilege, or there is a spousal privilege, or there is, for instance, a doctor-patient privilege that attaches to certain documents and is protected under our Indian Evidence Act. What is different in those privileges, which also find their basis in common law, and this particular privilege, is that those privileges arise from a protected relationship that is shared between the parties. It is the nature of the relationship over there as opposed to the nature of the document that protects that document and makes it inadmissible in evidence, barring certain exceptional circumstances. Whereas in the case of a without prejudice correspondence, it is, as I described, the nature of the correspondence itself. So, with that in mind, the entire objective in protecting these communications comes in because of a public policy justification. The idea behind protecting these communications is that parties in a commercial transaction should be encouraged so far as possible to negotiate their disputes out of courts, and to during such negotiations be able to frankly put all their cards on the table so that the best possible resolution can be arrived at, and not be afraid that in the event this negotiation fails and the matter goes to litigation, anything that they say during such negotiations will be used against them. So, in order for any document to attract this privilege, there are certain basic conditions that need to be satisfied. At the outset, this privilege is attracted to both oral and written communications. So it's not just a document that's labeled without prejudice that will be protected. It's also any telephonic discussions that you may have with the other side where you propose a resolution of the dispute, or anything that is said before a mediator, which will be protected and will be inadmissible in evidence. Secondly, in order to attract a without prejudice privilege to your document, it is essential that there has to be an actual issue between you and the party to whom you're addressing this communication, and that you are trying to negotiate a resolution of this issue. So simply a letter of claim, a recovery notice, a notice invoking any right that you have under any act will not amount to a without prejudice letter and will not attract this privilege, because it's effectively, by way of those notices, you are just setting out your claim, unless that notice also contains an offer to negotiate or an offer of settlement to the other side. Such a notice will ideally not fall within the contours of the without prejudice privilege. It's also important to note over here that while I am saying that this communication has to be in the context of negotiating a dispute, it's not necessary that there has to, at this point of time, already be a threat of litigation. So it's enough if from the content of such a communication, the court can gauge that there could be possibly litigation if whatever you are trying to negotiate doesn't work out. So to that extent, any communication which is negotiating any resolution with the underlying threat of the matter proceeding to litigation if the resolution were not to work out is protected by the without prejudice rule. It's also important that there should be an intention between both the parties to communicate on a without prejudice basis. For instance, if I, as a debtor, reach out to the creditor over a call or over a written piece of communication and extend and seek a concession on my debt without heading it as without prejudice or without giving any sort of an indication that I intend for this document to be without prejudice, this is then open to be adduced into evidence, and I cannot seek protection of the without prejudice rule because there was no express or implied understanding between me and the creditor that such a document was being adduced only under without prejudice negotiations. So it's very important to, at the outset, either label a communication when you're trying to negotiate a dispute from your end, either label it as without prejudice or at the very least have some sort of a mutual understanding that this offer is without prejudice to your rights and contentions. Actually, before going further at this point, I'll also want to highlight that under the common law, there is a difference between the term without prejudice used in the sense of the without prejudice rule, as opposed to the term without prejudice that we use in other senses. If there is a letter of claim or there is a recovery notice that is sent out, which is not headed without prejudice, but in which you reserve your rights without prejudice and to take any action against the debtor, that the use of that term as without prejudice is not equivalent to what we mean here is without prejudice under the without prejudice rule. Over there, you are just reserving a right or a remedy that you may have, whereas the without prejudice rule is a rule of evidence. I'll just try to differentiate that a little bit more once I'm done explaining the rule. So there are three key aspects that I have outlined. One is that this would apply to both oral and written communications. Second is that there must be a real issue between the parties and the communication must be sent in a genuine attempt to negotiate resolution. Third is that there must be an intention to communicate on a without prejudice basis. And the next key aspect is that you must be trying to adduce this kind of a communication against the interest of the party that has made this communication. It's very important to note that the law protects not just a communication that is sent by me, headed without prejudice, to the opposite side. The law also protects any communication, any reply that I may receive from the other end and the entire chain of correspondence, whether the chain then is headed without prejudice or not. The entire chain of correspondence is impliedly without prejudice and protected from being adduced into evidence. Even if I send a communication offering a concession on somebody's debt or offering to admit my debt and pay a lesser amount, and there is no reply to that offer from the other side, that failure to reply is also protected under the without prejudice privilege. So when I say that a communication is sought to be adduced as evidence against the interest of the party that made it, even trying to use the failure of a party to reply to your offer cannot be used against their interest. However, it's different when I, as a sender, recognize that the receiver may be prejudiced if they do not accept the offer that is contained in my letter. An example of that would be if I, as a debtor, send out an offer to all my creditors to pay them a lesser amount as in exchange for the debt that is due to them, and indicate that I am insolvent and I am not otherwise in a position to pay. In that sense, that document can be used as a proof of my insolvency, because in the event that my creditor does not accept the offer of the reduced payment that I am offering, they run the risk of losing their money entirely if I were to go on to become bankrupt or insolvent. So that's why the without prejudice communication has been held to be admissible as evidence to prove an act of bankruptcy against a debtor. The public policy justification doesn't come in to save a communication in this case, because there is a greater public policy in ensuring that an act of bankruptcy does not actually affect the rights of creditors. So, which is why such a communication will not be protected. Any questions? All right, I'll move on. So, as I think, mentioned earlier, labeling a document without prejudice is not enough. What is this? What is the crux of the rule is the substance of the document. It's actually the content of what you're trying to communicate as opposed to what you're labeling the document. So if you send out a recovery notice heading it without prejudice, that does not mean that later on you will not be able to rely on that notice, because simply speaking, a recovery notice is just a letter of claim. It's just setting out your rights, and there is no attempt to negotiate a resolution. And in that sense, it's not a true without prejudice letter. So it's not necessary to label a document. It's not just necessary to label a document without prejudice. It's also necessary to take into consideration what are the contents of such a letter. Lastly, it's very important to note that the English law has taken a very strict view of without prejudice privilege. The idea is to extend this privilege to all documents which are exchanged between the parties to a negotiation, unless the specific exceptions that are carved out apply to these documents. So to that extent, there can only be there can only be a waiver of such a privilege if it is a joint waiver. Both parties together have to either expressly or impliedly waive this privilege for a document which is admittedly without prejudice to become admissible in evidence. An example of an implied waiver would be if you refer to your without prejudice correspondence in supposedly open correspondence, that and seek to rely on this open correspondence in the course of your trial, that opens up the without prejudice correspondence to be relied upon by both parties. So this kind of a mistake should ideally be avoided. If you have a without prejudice correspondence, you should avoid referring to it in any other correspondence, any other pleading whatsoever. If one party seeks to rely on a without prejudice correspondence, which the other party also wants to rely on, that just opens up the document to become admissible in evidence. Any questions?
Hi, if I have issued a without prejudice letter to another party and the other party relies on it in open court, but I raise an objection to that, will that protect me?
Yes.
That...
Yes. So ideally, like I said, it's a joint privilege, and the waiver for on that document from being without prejudice has to be a joint waiver. But the only problem is that in Indian law, the rule has been applied a little differently. So when we come to that, I'll deal with your question a little bit more in the Indian context. But the English rule, the common law rule as it existed, would protect you entirely. That document will not be allowed to be adduced into evidence, will have to be removed from reference.
What if I do not raise an objection?
If you do not raise an objection, you're impliedly agreeing to that document being adduced. So to that extent, it will be then a waiver of your privilege.
Okay, all right.
So there are only 3 ways in which a without prejudice correspondence will be allowed to be adduced into evidence. Number one, like we just discussed, is waiver. If parties either expressly or impliedly waive their privilege, then the document will be adduced into evidence. Second is if the key aspects that I described, either all together or a few of these don't apply to any document, then in that case, that document isn't really a without prejudice, a document protected by the without prejudice privilege, and then to that extent can be adduced into evidence. And the third is if one of the exceptions apply. So we'll just move on to the exceptions now. In case anybody else has any questions with respect to the key aspects, I'll be happy to discuss them right now.
Sorry, Shilpa, can you please explain the second aspect to please once more?
Just So the second aspect is that there must be a real issue between the parties in question, and there must be a genuine attempt to negotiate a resolution. Is that it?
Yeah, okay.
So, like I said, it's not, the rule will not be attracted if parties are not negotiating an attempt at a resolution. If a communication headed without prejudice is sent across to the other side without there being any real issue at hand or without any dispute having been raised at that moment. For instance, I will describe a scenario where I, as a creditor, seek to recover my debts. And to that extent, I send out what we call a recovery notice and I head it without prejudice. But the contents of that notice are just me setting out my claim. What is the basis of my recovery claim? What is the amount I seek to recover, and possibly interest that I seek to recover? And if I give some time to the other side to, repay my debts and seek to proceed to litigation in the event those debts are not repaid within that time, this letter, even if it is headed without prejudice, will not be a without prejudice correspondence and will not to that extent be protected by this rule, because what it is simply a letter of claim. Now, the difference is in this letter, if there is a paragraph in which I state that I am willing to forego my interest, or I am willing to forego 50% of my debt if it is paid within the next 2 days, and I call on the other side to either accept this offer or deny it, that changes the entire letter of the correspondence to an attempt to negotiate this dispute or this issue that I have raised of my debt being due. Even if the other side fails to respond, the fact that I included a settlement offer or an offer to negotiate my debt in my letter makes this a without prejudice correspondence, regardless of whether or not I head it without prejudice. Sneha, was that you who asked this question? Is this enough? Can I move on?
Yes, please.
I didn't ask the question.
Okay, I'm sorry. All right, so there, like I said, the English law interprets this rule to be applied very strictly across all documents unless the very limited exceptions apply. So to that extent, the exceptions that I'm describing are all very, very strictly carved out and will only apply in very, very limited circumstances. In general, the policy is to extend this privilege to every single document which is exchanged in without prejudice negotiations. Unless where I am negotiating with another party and such negotiations actually result in a settlement, to that extent, the settlement agreement and possibly the correspondences which were exchanged for the purpose of settlement will be admissible just to demonstrate the fact that a settlement agreement has been arrived. For instance, if a debtor and a creditor negotiate and actually, like I described in my earlier example, if my letter where I offer to accept payments without interest or offer to accept 50% of my claim results in that claim being dealt with, the debtor accepts my offer and agrees to pay 50% of my claim immediately, I cannot then, after let's say a month or 2 months, sue for the remaining amount of my claim. And to that extent, that communication which I sent can be adduced into evidence to prove that there was in fact a settlement that was arrived at. Any questions? So I think this exception is pretty straight cut, that if any without prejudice correspondence demonstrates the fact of a concluded settlement agreement, then it will be admissible into evidence just for that limited purpose. No admissions that are made within the correspondence will be looked at. It will just be the factum of such a correspondence having been sent and the settlement having been arrived at through that correspondence. There is a circumstance that is envisaged when two parties to a negotiation arrive at a settlement. However, there is an ambiguity as to the terms of settlement, as to what was actually agreed. And in that case, those correspondences which help to a certain party's intention and what they had actually intended to do will be admissible to that extent. It's just a general principle of contract law that the intention of the parties is very important in construing the terms of any document. So it's that principle that is sort of applied here. A settlement agreement, just like any other contract, has to be construed in the context of what the parties intended when it was drafted and when it was agreed. If there are certain concessions that are made by one side, and if there are certain obligations that are put on the other side, what is the exact import of such concessions and obligations later on when one of the parties is seeking to escape from these obligations or such concessions that were made becomes relevant. So I'll give you an example. If there is an agreement between two parties to for the creditor to concede to accept a lower amount, and for the debtor to do its best to ensure that the remaining amount is paid back to the creditor in a reasonable time. Now, this is an example of a slightly ambiguous clause. In the event there is any dispute to this kind of a clause as to what amounts to a reasonable time within which the debtor has to repay the debt to the creditor, then the court will have to look at the without prejudice discussions, negotiations, and correspondences to the extent of understanding what are the considerations that went, in drafting such a clause and what was the intention of the parties who settled. This rule is also very, very, even within the exception, what will be looked at are only facts which are related to the dispute, and no admissions that are made within the documents will actually be admissible in evidence. The court will only look at the factual matrix to look at, to construe the settlement agreement. Any questions?
I have a question, Shilpa.
Yes.
We executed a settlement agreement in the context of a Section 138 case. And in the settlement agreement itself, we've included a clause which states that this amounts as an admission of the party that had to pay the amount.
Alright.
and would be used later in case in case of a breach or the failure of the party to pay the settlement amount. It would be used in the proceedings. Does that constitute a waiver once such an agreement that includes such a clause is executed by both the parties?
That will actually constitute a waiver, because while there is a public policy justification to the rule, there have been cases and there have been exceptions carved out where parties can negotiate against that public policy exception. So I'll answer your question a little bit more when I'm talking about the exception related to without prejudice save as to costs, because I think it makes sense there. But just briefly, if I am signing a settlement agreement where I'm agreeing to the document being used in any scenario, whether that be if I fail to pay or in any other circumstance, but I'm agreeing and I'm signing that on the dotted line, I am waiving my privilege to that extent to that document. But
I'm just coming in there, Shilpa, just to add to that in
Yes.
terms of both the public policy justification as well as what the parties have agreed. At the end of the day, as Shilpa has been saying, that the without prejudice rule is the reason for enforcement of such a rule is the underlying public policy that you want to encourage parties to settle their disputes and not engage in unnecessary litigation. So to the extent that there has been any such indication of settlement, it will be excluded from the purview. The parties wishing to rely upon it against the other party, which is given the concession, will not be allowed to do so. Now, the point in the example that you've given, Subbalakshmi, is that there is during an ongoing proceeding, parties have settled out of court. They captured the terms of that settlement in a document which they presented to court to finish off the litigation. The public policy justification to not allow the complainant in that case to refer to such a document is not there, because of the fact that it is subject to performance of this of the commitment by the accused or the respondent, that the complainant is withdrawing the complaint. So if the basis of the consideration for the complainant to be able to do so is itself getting compromised by the respondent not paying up, then clearly the justification goes. And then it becomes a basis to use a contract only to get away from the liability, which the law will not permit. So, and the second aspect is it is contractual. Parties are agreeing to settle this dispute by way of contract. Now, if one of the terms of the contract or the consideration under the contract is that the payment of this amount will be made by the respondent or the accused, and they fail to do so, then clearly the entire consideration goes. And then the waiver, actual or otherwise, that is recorded in that document, that they agree that this is an admission and that it is for the purposes of this document that they are agreeing to do so, and that it would be this document can be used by the complainant to take action against them in the event that they fail. All of that points to towards the fact that that there is a clear actual waiver of such a situation, but it will apply only in the event, of course, that there is a failure to adhere to the commitment made under the contract.
Just to clarify, not only would the breach of that particular settlement agreement give rise to a cause of action for another proceeding for breach of the agreement, but also give rise to the complainant's right to use that settlement agreement as evidence in the ongoing proceeding.
Absolutely, because then there is that's where I'm saying that as a default principle, an admission would have been permissible to be used in any proceedings. Now, the reason why this admission may not be used is because the parties are agreeing to to the overall public policy objective of settling the dispute, and therefore it should not be otherwise used. But if it is being used, this modus operandi of entering into the agreement only to get away from the immediate liability is actually going to be abused by the complainant, then clearly that cover of the without prejudice rule goes away. Independently, the accused respondent can argue that, look, I was forced, or this was brought about by coercion or undue influence, and I was actually not going to pay. All those are extraneous circumstances, and that they will have to demonstrate by way of evidence that any of these situations actually had got attracted to that document which was signed. But the without prejudice rule will not come to their aid.
But if your situation was slightly different, if your agreement only had them admitting to that debt and did not have a stipulation that that document could be used in the event they fail to pay, in that case, the creditor could argue that he admitted to the debt because he did not want to litigate further in the interest of just, not extending a litigation needlessly and just sort of ending it right then and there. And to that extent, that admission cannot be used against him because he was admitted it in the context of settlement negotiations.
All right.
Another aspect that I wanted to highlight is, could such an admission be used in a separate, in another litigation or by another third party who is neither the debtor or creditor who's admitting the debt over there? Could that third party whose own claim arises out of a related transaction seek to rely on such admissions that are made within settlement negotiations to buttress his claim? There is neither any admission being made by such a third party nor any concession being offered by such a third party. So the public policy justification does not come in to sort of protect such a communication from being relied upon by a third party. So in that case, could such a third party rely on this document to buttress their own claim arising from such a transaction? Does anyone want to try to answer? All right. So under common law, it has been held that such communications will not be protected, will not be used even in other related litigations or subsequent litigations between the same parties as well. Again, the idea is any person seeking to rely on any admission, any concession that I make still hits at the public policy justification, still would, if I was as a debtor of the view that another creditor, not the creditor with respect to whom I'm making the admission or the concession, will seek to rely on my admission and try to enforce a liability against me, that would stop me from putting all my cards on the table and to that extent hamper negotiation and resolutions of dispute outside court. So no other third party can also rely on such negotiations unless, and now this is like a exception that has been carved out, if I as a debtor owe my debt to a creditor who is a middle party who again owes a debt to his own creditor. So there's party A who is the debtor here, there's party B who is a creditor, and there's party C who is B's creditor. And the credit extended by C to B is directly dependent on my transaction with B. So if A defaults on its debt to B, then B automatically defaults on its debt to C. In that circumstance, if A and B arrive at a settlement and later on there is a continuing action between B and C, C can seek to rely on without prejudice communications that are exchanged between A and B to the limited extent to try to prove that the settlement that has been arrived between A and B is disproportionate. B has settled at a lower amount than it should have. and is thereby trying to defeat C's claim to that extent. Are there any questions? All right, so I'll move on. So without prejudice communications to that extent can be used to construe the facts of a settlement agreement even by a third party. There are exceptions that are carved out from without prejudice communication cannot be used if can be used, I apologize, if such a settlement that has been arrived at under such negotiations is arrived at on the basis of misrepresentation, fraud, or undue influence. These are usual contractual, what do you say, or usual contractual grounds to make any agreement void or voidable. So if a party alleges that there is some sort of a misrepresentation of facts or there was undue influence of fraud, and in order to prove these claims, the contents of the without prejudice communication will be adduced into evidence to prove these claims. This is extended a little further in the cases of perjury or blackmail. The ground that has been sort of devised by courts in order for a party to prove these claims of misrepresentation, fraud, undue influence, perjury, or blackmail is that a party must prove unambiguous impropriety. What this means is that the courts understand that during without prejudice negotiations or during any negotiations between parties to a commercial dispute, there will be some element of posturing. There will be some element of, trying to hide your true position because you are trying to hedge the risk and not put all your cards on the table in the event this were to fail. So to that extent, just alleging misrepresentation when a party was just trying to protect its commercial interests will not be allowed. What you have to prove is that there was a dishonest intent behind, and there was a dishonest intent and an intent to hide facts or to misrepresent facts, or that there was a illegal threat or blackmail that was used by the other party, which was unambiguously improper. It is not something which can be envisaged in commercial negotiations between parties. So there was an English case where a debtor in the course of a dispute, in the course of a litigation, reached out to the creditor to negotiate the dispute and to possibly arrive at a middle ground. During the course of these negotiations, what the debtor did is that the debtor had an investigation carried out into the creditor's personal affairs, found out a lot of damning information, and used that information to threaten the creditor and his reputation and get him to settle at a lower amount. These communications that were made to threaten the creditor were allowed to be adduced into evidence despite the fact that they were exchanged during without prejudice negotiations. The idea being that you cannot allow an illegal or improper, in fact, activity to be protected under the without prejudice privilege. Another exception is if during without prejudice communications, I promise to do something and the other party acts on the basis of my promise to do or to not do something, and thereafter I renege on that position. My earlier promise will give rise to an estoppel, and to that extent, a without prejudice communication can be used to prove that statement and to prove the existence of estoppel. I'll briefly just give an example. There was a case of a plaintiff alleging passing off and infringement of copyright against the defendant. However, initially, while filing their suit, they filed only a suit seeking passing off, as they did not have enough information to allege infringement. They included it within their notice that they sent to the defendant, but they did not actually go on to sue for infringement. They received an ex parte injunction on their passing off action, and thereafter began negotiations with the defendant as to what should be the way forward. After receiving the ex parte injunction, the defendant gave an undertaking to the court that they would not be using the design that was alleged to be infringed till such time as the entire suit was decided. Basis that undertaking, the plaintiff felt that they were adequately protected and that they would want their passing off action to be dealt with and to be decided before they take any action with respect to their copyright infringement claim. And the defendant also had its own personal interests in wanting the whole trial to be resolved quickly, and agreed under without prejudice communications with the plaintiff that any action for infringement of copyright could then possibly be taken at a later stage when the passing of action had already been decided. In exchange for this, the plaintiff undertook to make good any damages that were suffered by the defendant in the event that their action were to fail. However, all of this was hinged on both their actions. While giving this undertaking as to damages, the plaintiff clarified that it was with respect to both its passing off action and its copyright action. Subsequently, the plaintiff's passing off action failed, and they then sought to bring a copyright infringement claim, which they by that time had enough evidence and believed was a stronger claim. However, the defendant raised the issue that because the plaintiff had failed to bring such a claim at the first instance, they were now stopped from bringing that claim. They could now not allege copyright infringement. In order to prove that this was a litigation strategy mutually adopted between the defendant and the plaintiff was allowed to adduce those without prejudice communications into trial to show that it was on the basis of the defendant's concession that the plaintiff had stayed its hand and had not proceeded with its copyright infringement claim, and to that extent, the defendant was stopped from raising this defense at trial. So without prejudice communications can be brought in to prove the existence of a statement that is relied on by the other party, which statement can give rise to an estoppel. This rule has been slightly modified to also extend to statements which prove that there is a delay in terms of the Limitation Act, and this delay can be explained away because of the settlement negotiations. So, for instance, if during settlement negotiations there is an acknowledgement of debt from the debtor to the creditor, and it's as a result of that that acknowledgement of debt that the creditor decides to wait a bit and to not rush with filing its suit purely to reserve limitation, then to that extent, that statement of liability, not as an admission, but just as a statement of liability in terms of acknowledgement of debt under the Limitation Act, will be adduced into evidence in order to show that there was no delay. There is a judgment of the English House of Lords that I want to just refer to here, which really beautifully espouses the public policy justification for allowing such a communication. I'll just show the relevant paragraph so that everyone understands. Sir, I am not able to share the screen. Abhishek sir. What I'll do is I'll just read it out really quickly. The case, as I said, involved negotiations between a creditor and a debtor.
I'm sorry, Shilpa. What did you want me to do?
Sir, I'm not able to share my screen. That option is not available to me. And I wanted to show Bradford.
Which one do you want me to take out? Which case?
So Bradford and Bingley. The delay.
This one.
Acknowledgement of debt can be used to prove that there is no delay.
That was a Grimsby.
So it was, yeah, Bradford and Bingley.
Just give me a second. Sorry.
Shilpa, Abhishek, I found it. Do you want me to share my screen?
Yes, if you can.
Yeah. Just tell me which paras you want to go to, okay?
Okay.
Can you guys see the screen now?
I still can't.
No, sir.
No, not yet.
Okay, we've got Hiral's screen, I think, now.
Yes.
Yes, you can
Yes.
see it.
Yes.
You all can see it? Okay. Yeah.
Yep, thanks.
Hiral, can you just go to paragraph 3? Yes, thank you. So I'll just draw everyone's attention to the 5th line about, 5th or 6th line. It begins from, but it takes 2 to negotiate. So what the court held here is, but it takes 2 to negotiate, and there is also a public policy in encouraging the creditor not to initiate legal proceedings. The acknowledgement rule plays an important part in furthering this policy because it means that a creditor negotiating on the basis that his debt has been acknowledged can proceed with the negotiations and give time to pay without being distracted by the sound of time's winged chariot behind him. It is also unfair that a debtor who does not dispute his indebtedness should be able to ask for time and then use that indulgence to rely on the statute. So I'll just, this judgment for anyone seeking to analyze this rule a little bit more is a beautiful judgment. But what over here the Court of Appeal did is that it added added another aspect to the public policy justification and looked at it from a creditor's angle as opposed to just a debtor's angle, and being said that encouraging parties to negotiate does not just involve a debtor not being afraid that an admission will be used against him. It also necessarily involves that a creditor should not be afraid to negotiate and then lose out on account of limitations. So these communications can be brought in from the purposes of acknowledgement of debt under the Limitation Act. However, the House of Lords was very, very clear in clarifying that these communications will not be looked at by way of like any admission made therein will not be looked at in evidence. They will just be admitted to the extent of it being the mere fact that something was admitted, and that extended the limitation clock, so to say. Anybody has any questions? So the last exception that we arrive at is when there is a settlement arrived at and such discussions are termed without prejudice save as to costs. There is this is a very interesting exception, because this is allowing parties to contractually to basically contract out of the public policy justification. The idea here is English courts usually award costs to the losing party, and the losing party has to pay costs to the other side. It's just a usual course. So during negotiations, what could induce another party to settle is that even if they lose the case because they are agreeing to some amount of debt, they will not have to pay costs, and the costs will be either shared between the parties or probably borne by the plaintiff. This could induce a defendant to admit its liability and settle, which is why without prejudice save as to costs is allowed. However, if there is later on any attempt to renege on this settlement, these communications will be allowed to be adduced into evidence. So I think earlier I had, there are two cases in which I had highlighted that just the mere statement and not the admission that is being made by the statement will be allowed to be adduced into evidence, and without prejudice communications will be considered to the extent of that statement having been made. What I wanted to focus a bit on is what happens when the statement just does not lead to an estoppel, and the statement does not lead to any limitation issues, but is a statement which exists as to the fact of something having been done, a legal obligation having been satisfied by one party or another. I will give an example. There are usually arbitration clauses between parties which tend to envisage a pre-arbitral mechanism of either conciliation or mediation between the parties before a dispute is taken to arbitration. So if I have a without prejudice communication in which I have statements where I am satisfying that requirement of trying to negotiate the dispute amicably by way of conciliation or mediation prior to taking it to litigation, can I then rely on that without prejudice correspondence to prove the factum of me having complied with my contractual or legal obligation? The answer is yes. This is what is popularly known as the Mueller exception. The Mueller exception comes in to the extent that you have to take a without prejudice correspondence into consideration in the event that in the absence of such correspondence, the issue would be non-justiciable. That, a judge cannot possibly decide a dispute without having regard to a without prejudice correspondence. To that extent, the without prejudice correspondence has to be taken into consideration. This is not an official exception to the without prejudice rule, and it's still heavily debated amongst judges. But the Mueller exception is the widest possible exception that exists, because what is justiciable or not justiciable is up to debate. But one of the situations that I sort of just described could be an example where my pre-contractual liability to refer the dispute to conciliation or amicable resolution between parties before taking it to arbitration cannot possibly be satisfied without having regard to my without prejudice correspondence, in that case, that without prejudice correspondence will be taken into consideration purely to satisfy the factum of my contractual or legal obligation having been satisfied. Does anybody have any questions? All right, so this is briefly how the rule exists under the English law. I will quickly move on to how the rule exists under Indian law, but before that, I'll just quickly run you through how the rule exists in other jurisdiction. I'm not going to go into detail, but virtually every common law Commonwealth country has adopted this rule, and some variations of the rule have also found their place in civil law jurisdictions and in fact, even nowadays in countries which don't necessarily follow either one of these, there is a basis for without prejudice privilege in laws of United Arab Emirates, USA, Norway, Sweden, Canada, Singapore, Australia, everywhere. What I have seen is that usually in various jurisdictions, the application of the rule tends to change, but in more cases than not, the rule is applied strictly the way it is under the English law, and it extends as a class privilege or a blanket privilege. The only exception that I seem to have seen is courts in the United States, which don't give a very strict application to the rule, and the rule is applied more on a case-to-case basis, and that position is similar to what has ultimately been followed in India. In India, the codification of this without prejudice rule and this protection is the section 23 of the Indians Act. Can someone, I'm so sorry, share the screen of section 23?
Can people see? Okay. Sorry.
I'm sorry, are there multiple screens being shared? I'll switch off mine then.
Hello. Hi, can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
So has everybody read this section? It says that in civil cases, no admission is relevant if it is made either upon an express condition that evidence of it is not to be given. So what this seems to indicate is that under the Indian Evidence Act, as opposed to the English rule, we only protect admissions and not just any statement that were to be made in any settlement negotiation. This kind of runs contrary to the public policy justification, because if I as a party think that only my admissions will be protected and not any other statements, I may be very careful and may not place all my cards on the table while negotiating, and just have to think twice about everything that I am saying, and that runs contrary to what was envisaged under the English law. I'll just quickly, Hiral, if you can go to section 17, which is the definition of admissions under the Indian Evidence Act.
Yeah, just give me a minute. Huh?
Yes. I'll just read out the definition. So section 17 defines an admission as a statement, oral or documentary, or contained in electronic form, which suggests any inference as to any fact in issue or relevant fact, and which is made by any of the persons under the circumstances hereinafter mentioned. So as you can see, the definition of admission itself is quite broad, and so the definition of admission will within itself include all possible statements that will be made in the course of compromise negotiations, and will therefore be then protected. So if read 23 and 17 are read together, then it seems that the without prejudice rule, even under the Indian Act, has the same kind of protection and the same kind of ambit that it does under the English common law. However, what is shocking, I mean, this justification is not supported by how the courts in India have construed this rule. But before going to that, I'll quickly just refer to what was expounded by the Supreme Court in the first case that dealt with this rule. Just a moment. Since I can't share my screen, I'll just briefly outline it. What the Supreme Court has held is that a without prejudice rule has to be applied on a case-to-case basis. This is very different from the position in English law where, like I highlighted, the English courts will apply the rule across the board and will only lift the privilege on a case-to-case basis. But the Indian Supreme Court has not given such a blanket privilege to without prejudice communications, and has in fact stated that only in certain cases where the implication of such a label means that the matter has not been decided on merits, will the without prejudice privilege be granted, and such documents will be protected from being adduced into evidence. I don't think that this is actually in lines with what our Evidence Act states and in lines with what has been laid down under the common law, because this doesn't seem to actually encourage settlements and encourage the public policy justification that has been outlined under the English law. But what the Supreme Court actually feels is that merely if a document is marked without prejudice, but there is nothing to indicate that the document is a document which is exchanged between parties while negotiating, or contains any admissions whatsoever, then it will not be protected. And if the document has actually contains contents of a negotiation, but but also is in furtherance of an illegal objective, then to that extent without prejudice privilege will be lifted. The issue with this is that under the English law, it's only if there is a criminal objective, like I highlighted, if there is perjury or blackmail, or if there is a dishonest intention that you're seeking to establish, only then will the without prejudice privilege be lifted. But in the Indian case, any illegal objective is sufficient for the courts to lift the without prejudice privilege. In extension of that, in India, without prejudice privilege can be lifted even if the court feels that there is a public policy justification for lifting the privilege. There have not been many cases where the courts have dealt with what this would mean and what the contours of the public policy justification for lifting the privilege would be. Suffice it to say that the Indian courts have sufficiently diluted the without prejudice rule and the way it exists in the common law. Does anybody have any questions? So just to conclude, I'll just want to highlight that there is, like I had said at the beginning of the discussion, a stark difference in how the without prejudice privilege is treated under the Indian Evidence Act as opposed to the other privileges that we have under sections 122 to 132. Not only is the fact that the without prejudice privilege finds itself mentioned in a completely different portion of the enactment, which is section 23, as opposed to all the other privileges being bunched up together in sections 122 to 132, but also as to the clarity with which these sections have been sort of expounded. Every exception that exists in the Indian law to an attorney-client privilege or to a privilege as to state documents has been very well set out in the Indian Evidence Act, but the without prejudice privilege has not been that well expounded. There have been attempts such as the 185th report of the Law Commission of India, where suggestions were made to add provisos to the definition to make it more complete and to ensure that the public policy justification is not diluted. And in the 185th report, the Law Commission actually suggested that the exceptions of without prejudice save as to costs and without prejudice being lifted only for the purposes of construing a settlement agreement, the factum of a settlement agreement be added to the Indian Evidence Act. But these have clearly not been incorporated, showing that in India, we do not give the same level of importance to the without prejudice privilege as it has been given under the English courts. And does anyone have any questions?
Shilpa, did you deal with that aspect of, merely calling it correspondence without prejudice does not attract the rule?
Yes, sir.
Okay, sure. I had another call, so that's why I was checking. Any other questions that anyone has on this?
Shilpa, hi, Hiral here.
Hi.
So Shilpa, sometimes, when we are corresponding with international companies and we get emails, at the end of the email, they sign off by saying all rights reserved. Does it mean the same thing?
No. So without prejudice used in that sense is just you reserving a legal right or remedy that you may have. Whereas a without prejudice discussion, while arising from the same thought process, is different. For a without prejudice privilege or a without prejudice discussion, it's necessary that there is some negotiation, there's an underlying dispute and there is a negotiation to amicably resolve it. So when I am just saying that, I'm sending you this communication without prejudice to my rights or remedies under law, that doesn't attract the same kind of privilege unless there is a dispute between us and I am making some sort of an offer or asking you to make an offer to amicably settle it.
Okay, noted.
Any other questions?
And you said that in the Indian perspective, we've taken like a really wide perspective and, kind of watered down what the English law said. Have there been any, maybe in some other case, not really a case on the subject, but where, they have said, because see, even as per the note, it says that it would mean that in different situations, we would need to interpret it differently, right?
Yes.
So have there been any other cases where like a different interpretation has been taken, where they've kind of narrowed the scope or, given some sort of other meaning to what it can mean in the Indian context?
No, so which is the shocking bit, because under the Indian law, it's the rule is not the jurisprudence doesn't simply exist. Even the case which says that it has to be interpreted on a case-to-case manner goes on to lift the privilege on the basis of a public policy justification of the document having needing to be adduced into evidence. What I wanted to highlight is that Indian courts are very quick to lift the privilege, as opposed to the English courts, which will lift it very, very reluctantly. So when the Indian courts say that it will be interpreted on a case-to-case basis, what they actually mean is that they'll interpret what is their reason of lifting it in every case, which is what has been seen in the few cases that deal with the without prejudice rule, as opposed to the English courts where the privilege will not be lifted unless and until the public policy justification itself does not make sense in that case.
Okay.
Does anybody else have any questions? Sanya, if you had asked a question earlier, as I think about if you have a without prejudice correspondence which the other party adduces in court. So in India, I am not sure how protected you will be, even though the Indian Evidence Act seems to be widely worded enough to protect you in all circumstances. The approach that Indian courts have adopted may not actually protect you.
The only other provision in our body of laws which would give some semblance of assistance to the fact that at least during the course of a mediation proceedings, things are supposed to be kept confidential, even though it may not be strictly applicable as is Section 75 of the Arbitration Conciliation Act. Shilpa, did you allude to that?
No, sir.
Okay, so I mean, as we all know, we primarily use the Arbitration Act for arbitration purposes, but there is also a chapter on conciliation, Part 3, which starts in 61 and goes on till 76. And in that there's a provision, Section 75. It talks about confidentiality and says, notwithstanding anything contained in any other laws, which non-obstante clause, the conciliator and the parties shall keep confidential all matters relating to conciliation proceedings. Confidentiality shall extend also to the settlement agreement, except where its disclosure is necessary for the purposes of implementation and enforcement. So I think one of the questions that I think, Subha, you had asked originally and we were discussing with regard to the settlement agreement that you were talking about, even though this provision applies to a conciliation proceedings as envisaged under the Arbitration and Conciliation Act. But in the event that there is any lack of provision which could fill in the gap of trying to answer this question, one could look at 75. And that's what we were discussing. In the event that that agreement in itself has to be enforced or implemented because either of the parties is in breach, then you can rely upon the admission made in that agreement, and the confidentiality will not extend to that. And then, sorry, this goes on till 81. 81 is also a provision that could be looked at. The parties shall not rely on or introduce as evidence in arbitral or judicial proceedings, whether or not such proceedings relate to the dispute that is the subject of the conciliation proceedings, views expressed or suggestions made by the other party in respect of a possible settlement of the dispute, B, admissions made by the other party in the course of the conciliation proceedings, C, proposals made by the conciliator, and D, the fact that the other party had indicated his willingness to accept a proposal for settlement made by the conciliator. So I think at least with regard to the mediation conciliation process, there is a fairly detailed coverage of all communication and all disclosures and all admissions and all statements and all indications of intent that form part of that process through section 75 and 81.
Thank you, sir. Does anyone have any questions?
I think if not, then I think we can bring this meeting to a close. Thanks a lot, Shilpa. Thank you, Hiral, for helping us with the technology challenge. And thank you all for
anytime.
Patient audience. We'll continue the series again tomorrow, and we will be shortly circulating an email to you with regard to the topic that we are discussing tomorrow. Shilpa, do you have the topic handy for you with you, so that whoever's on the call, we can actually let them know?
So we go through the we'll actually just cover initiating an arbitration. So just the provisions under the Arbitration and Conciliation Act which relate to that. How to initiate an arbitration, and what are the appropriate ways to ensure that that is done correctly.
Yeah.
If you want to step in here. Oh, I think she didn't hear me. So yeah, basically just that. We'll just be covering initiation of an arbitration and all provisions relating to that, such as sending a notice, probably filing your petition for appointment of arbitrator, things like that.
Yeah, because very often what happens is that there could be,
glitches.
One could resort to actions which may have an impact on the arbitral proceeding themselves, giving rise to a Section 16 application for dismissal at the threshold itself. Then the amount of control that is to be exercised by the appointing court, especially when there are, and when the issues that arise, if there are multiple parties to the arbitration, whether as claimants or on the other side, factors such as signatories versus non-signatories being bound to the arbitration agreement, all those issues we'll be discussing tomorrow. So thanks, guys.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Shilpa. Thank you, Abhishek.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, Shilpa. Thanks, Abhishek. Bye.
Thank you. Hello. नहीं मैंने बोला मैं 9-10 बजे तक उठूंगी मैं पूरा तो प्रिपेयर करूंगी ना अपनी 50 प्रेजेंटेशन के लिए आई नो बट रात को मैं नींद नहीं आ रही नहीं आ रही ना नींद नहीं आ रही आपको मैंने कल बताया था मेरी प्रेजेंटेशन में आपने छोड़ो आपकी वैसे रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटी